In the heart of West Africa, in the land of the Igbo, there is a story buried beneath the soil that too many of us have forgotten, a story not carved into the monuments of conquerors, nor preserved in the annals of empires, but a story whispered in the artifacts uncovered at Igbo Ukwu. In the 9th century, when much of the world was still stumbling through darkness, the Igbo were already shaping iron with a brilliance that startled archaeologists 1,000 years later. They had discovered not only the secret of smelting iron, but the artistry of turning it into tools, ornaments, and symbols of status that spoke of a civilization as advanced as any on earth. To speak of Igbo Ukwu is to speak of a people who were far ahead of their time, a people whose mastery of metalwork rivaled the finest traditions of Asia and Europe, a people who remind us that Africa was never a passive land waiting for the world to awaken it, but a cradle of innovation, beauty, and genius. When archaeologists unearthed the treasures of Igbo Ukwu in the 20th century, the world stood in disbelief. How could such sophisticated bronzes, cast with a precision so advanced, have come from a village in Nigeria? How could a people supposedly without kings or empires create art and technology that defied imagination? Yet the evidence was undeniable. Buried deep within the earth were vessels, ornaments, and ritual objects fashioned with such skill that metallurgists had to admit that the Igbo of the 9th century possessed techniques centuries ahead of Europe. Lost wax casting, intricate beadwork, elaborate designs that seemed to dance upon the metal, all revealed a level of artistry that shattered stereotypes of Africa as primitive. The people of Igbo Ukwu had not only discovered iron but had elevated it into a symbol of culture, identity, and power. Their work stood as testimony that Africa was never silent, never still, never behind, but always forging its destiny with fire and wisdom. Iron was not merely a tool of survival, it was the foundation of transformation. With iron came stronger farming implements, sharper weapons, and sturdier foundations for building. The Igbo of the 9th century were not merely crafting artifacts, they were reshaping their world. Iron gave them the strength to cultivate more land, to protect their families, to expand their trade, and to connect with peoples beyond their borders. Every stroke of the smith's hammer was a declaration that the Igbo were builders of civilization. Their discovery of iron was not accidental. It was a breakthrough that changed their destiny. And in this discovery they laid the foundation for the wealth of their culture, a wealth that would echo through centuries, surviving even the storms of colonialism and slavery. The story of Igbo Ukwu is also the story of vision. To look at raw ore and imagine the weapon, the vessel, the ornament hidden inside is an act of genius. It is the ability to see what others cannot see, to shape possibility from the stubbornness of stone. The Igbo smiths were not merely artisans, they were visionaries. They taught their people that greatness is not given but forged, that strength lies not in waiting for others to deliver opportunity but in creating it with one's own hand. This vision became the heartbeat of Igbo identity, a people who refused to be defined by kings and crowns, a people who found their strength not in hierarchy but in creativity, resilience, and self-reliance. The furnaces of Igbo Ukwu were more than fire pits. They were schools of destiny, teaching each generation that true wealth comes not from what you are handed but from what you are willing to build. And yet for centuries the world ignored this. The narrative of Africa was twisted into one of passivity and backwardness, as if the continent had been sleeping until Europe arrived to awaken it. But Igbo Ukwu shouts against that lie. It tells us that while Europe was still struggling through the Dark Ages, the Igbo had mastered metallurgy with techniques so complex they remain difficult to replicate today. It tells us that Africa was not a land waiting to be discovered but a land already discovering, already advancing, already creating. Every artifact pulled from Igbo Ukwu is a voice from the ancestors declaring, "We were here, we were brilliant, and we will not be erased." The century the Igbo discovered iron was a century that rewrote the very definition of civilization, even if the world refused to acknowledge it. The legacy of Igbo Ukwu is not just in the metal but in the spirit it represents. It is the spirit of resilience, the spirit of self-determination, the spirit of a people who knew that freedom must be forged with your own hands. When the fires of colonization later tried to reduce the Igbo to ashes, it was this spirit that refused to die. When the chains of slavery sought to strip them of dignity, it was this spirit that kept them unbroken. For the same fire that smelted iron in the 9th century burned in the hearts of those who resisted oppression, who refused to bow, who carried their traditions across oceans and into the New World. The century of iron was not a mere historical event. It was the forging of a character, the shaping of a people who would stand unshaken through centuries of trial. Look closely at the artifacts of Igbo Ukwu and you will see more than beauty. You will see memory. Every spiral etched into bronze, every bead carefully crafted, every vessel molded with care is a story of ancestors who dreamed beyond their time. They understood that their work was not only for utility but for legacy. They built objects to last, to survive, to speak long after their voices were silenced. And today those objects speak still, reminding us that history is not only what is written in books, but what is preserved in the silent testimony of craft. To hold an artifact from Igbo Ukwu is to hold the determination of a people, the vision of a civilization, the brilliance of a heritage too powerful to be erased. The lesson of Igbo Ukwu reaches beyond history. It is a message for the present and the future. In a world where many still struggle to reclaim dignity, the Igbo remind us that greatness is not bestowed by others but discovered within. The 9th century artisans did not wait for permission to innovate. They dared to experiment, to fail, to try again until fire yielded to their vision. That daring spirit is what the modern world needs. It tells us that no matter how heavy the chains of misrepresentation, no matter how thick the fog of lies, the truth will always rise like iron from the fire. The Igbo are not defined by colonial borders or foreign narratives. They are defined by the fire of their ancestors, the innovation of their artisans, the resilience of their communities, and the brilliance of their vision. When we speak of Igbo Ukwu, we are not simply describing a chapter in African history. We are reclaiming the truth of human civilization. We are saying that Africa was never in darkness, that its people were never silent, that its hands shaped wonders long before the world cared to listen. We are saying that the Igbo in the 9th century discovered more than iron. They discovered the power of self-determination, the beauty of creativity, and the strength of resilience. This is why their story matters, because it tears down the lies of inferiority and replaces them with a fire that tells every African child, you come from brilliance, you come from greatness, you come from a people who forged civilizations when others doubted. So let the story of Igbo Ukwu be told again and again. Let it remind us that the furnaces of our ancestors still burn within us. Let it inspire us to build, to create, to lead, to rise. For if the Igbo of the 9th century could discover iron and turn it into art that astonishes the world 1,000 years later, then surely we too can discover within ourselves the power to reshape our destiny. The century the Igbo discovered iron is not a distant tale. It is a living fire, a call to every heart that dares to dream, that dares to forge, that dares to believe that greatness is not given but created. And as long as that fire burns, the legacy of Igbo Ukwu will never die. When we speak of iron as the foundation of civilization, we are not simply talking about a metal. We are speaking about a force that reshaped human destiny, a discovery that turned the ordinary into the extraordinary and placed scattered peoples on new paths of strength and prosperity. For the Igbo of the 9th century, the mastery of iron was not a minor development, but a revolution, a transformation so complete that it altered their relationship with the land, with their neighbors, and with the world beyond. Before iron, life was bound by the limits of stone and wood, tools that dulled quickly, weapons that broke easily, and farming implements that demanded back-breaking labor with little reward. But with the furnace and the forge, the Igbo unlocked a power that gave them new eyes to see possibilities, new hands to shape their environment, and new strength to build communities that could thrive where others struggled. The soil that once resisted cultivation now yielded under iron hoes. Forests that seemed impenetrable gave way to iron axes, and food that had once been scarce became abundant. Farming, once a battle against nature, became a partnership, and with that partnership came surpluses. With surpluses came trade, and with trade came networks, that carried Igbo influence far beyond their villages. Iron did more than feed the stomach, it fed the imagination. A people who had struggled daily to wrest survival from the land suddenly found themselves with time and resources to think beyond the immediate. Stronger tools meant fields produced more than enough to sustain families, and this surplus freed artisans to experiment with craft, freed thinkers to debate, freed communities to imagine futures greater than mere survival. Out of iron came not only tools and weapons but art, symbols and rituals that embodied the soul of a people. The smith became not just a worker of metal, but a custodian of destiny, one who turned fire into freedom. In every village, the forge glowed as a reminder that the community was not powerless against the challenges of life. Each hammer strike echoed a truth, that strength was not granted from above but forged from within. Trade too was reborn in the age of iron. With stronger implements, Igbo farmers grew crops in abundance. Yam, cassava, and vegetables flowed from their fields, feeding both their kin and their neighbors. Surpluses turned into currency, and markets blossomed into great centers of exchange where iron tools were as valuable as cowries, where beads and salt met spears and ornaments, where goods carried across rivers and forests linked Igbo villages to distant people. The market was no longer a place of barter alone, but a theater of culture where identity was expressed in what one created, sold, and exchanged. Iron gave the Igbo access to wider networks, and through these networks they carried not only goods but ideas, songs, proverbs, and beliefs weaving themselves into the larger fabric of Africa's history. And iron gave in a world where survival was always under threat, where raids, conflicts, and rivalries were part of life, iron weapons provided security. Spears tipped with iron, knives forged in the fire, and protective charms crafted from the same material turned villages into fortresses of resilience. Communities that once might have been vulnerable now stood strong, not because they sought conquest, but because they valued freedom and refused to be subdued. Iron did not make the Igbo aggressors, it made them guardians of their autonomy. It taught them that a people with the power to defend themselves would never easily be broken, that dignity is best preserved by strength ready to rise when challenged. What makes the Igbo story extraordinary is that this mastery of iron was not only practical, but philosophical. The transformation it brought was woven into the very identity of the people. Their proverbs, their rituals, their governance all absorbed the symbolism of fire and metal. To forge iron was to forge character. To work the furnace was to understand that life itself requires heat, pressure, and endurance to bring forth beauty and strength. In this way, the blacksmith became more than a craftsman. He became a teacher, reminding the community that resilience is born from trial, that beauty emerges from struggle, and that freedom is hammered into shape with discipline and courage. Iron was not only the foundation of material civilization, it was the metaphor of Igbo existence, a lesson repeated from one generation to the next, that no obstacle is greater than the fire within. The discovery of iron also created pathways of power that were not concentrated in the hands of a king, but shared across the fabric of society. Unlike empires that used metallurgy to glorify rulers with thrones and weapons of domination, the Igbo used iron to strengthen the everyday lives of farmers, mothers, and traders. The hoe in the hand of a farmer was as powerful a symbol of civilization as the spear in the hand of a warrior. The cooking pot, the ornament, the ritual object, all forged from metal, spoke of a people who saw strength not only in warfare but in sustenance, beauty, and community. This balance kept Igbo society vibrant and decentralized, where innovation belonged not to a palace but to the village, not to a throne but to the forge, not to one man but to the entire people. When archaeologists uncovered the treasures of Igbo Ukwu in the 20th century, they were stunned because they saw more than remnants of metal. They saw evidence of a society that had harnessed iron to build a complex world. The bronzes revealed a sophistication so advanced that even today experts marvel at their precision. The artifacts told the story of a civilization that had found its foundation not in conquest, but in creativity, not in crowns, but in community. They revealed that the Igbo had long ago discovered what many societies still struggle to understand, that the true measure of greatness is not how much power one man holds, but how much strength the people share. The significance of iron in the Igbo story is not a relic of the past, it is a living challenge to the present. It calls to us to remember that progress is forged through resilience, that abundance is created through innovation, and that freedom is preserved through strength. The century the Igbo discovered iron was not only a chapter in history, it was the dawn of a legacy. It reminds us that civilization is not imported but created, that no people are ever without genius, and that Africa's story is not one of waiting but of building. The foundation of iron laid in the 9th century still supports the identity of a people who have endured slavery, colonization, and marginalization yet remain unbroken, still hammering their destiny against the anvil of history. Iron is the foundation of civilization because it teaches that fire and pressure can transform weakness into strength. For the Igbo, this was more than metallurgy, it was life itself. It was the knowledge that greatness is not found in the gifts of others but in the sparks we strike for ourselves. It was the courage to face the stubbornness of the earth and bring forth abundance. It was the wisdom to take what seemed ordinary and turn it into something extraordinary. And it is this lesson, born in the forges of Igbo Ukwu, that still burns today, that we are the smiths of our destiny, and that with vision, resilience, and unity, we too can forge a civilization that will astonish the world. To understand the vision of the Igbo artisan is to step into a world where ordinary eyes saw only rocks and earth, but extraordinary minds saw the promise of beauty, power, and transformation hidden within. In the 9th century, when the fires of Igbo Ukwu glowed against the darkness, it was not merely the discovery of iron or bronze that mattered, but the daring imagination of the men and women who looked at raw ore and believed that it could be shaped into something greater than itself. They saw not what was, but what could be. Not the stubbornness of stone, but the fluidity of possibility. To pick up unrefined metal and imagine a spiral that could adorn a chief's wrist. To melt stubborn ore into liquid fire and guide it into molds of impossible delicacy, required a mind unafraid of failure and a spirit unwilling to be limited by the obvious. This was the genius of the Igbo artisan, the courage to see what others dismissed, the patience to coax beauty from the rawest material, and the conviction that human hands guided by vision could command even the hardest elements of nature to yield to creativity. The artisans of Igbo Ukwu were more than craftsmen. They were dreamers and inventors, storytellers in metal whose words took the form of intricate ornaments, elaborate vessels, and sacred objects that still leave the modern world in awe. Each artifact was a sentence in the long story of a people determined to carve their identity not in paper or stone, but in metal that would endure for 1,000 years. The bracelets, anklets, and pendants they created were not only decorations but proclamations, announcing to the world that the Igbo understood beauty, status, and symbolism with a depth equal to any other civilization. Their vessels, cast in shapes so precise that scholars today still marvel at their technical mastery, carried more than offerings for rituals. They carried the weight of cultural memory, of belief systems that placed community above kingship and spirituality above domination. What made these works remarkable was not only the level of skill but the foresight that guided them, the understanding that art was not a luxury but a necessity, that beauty was as essential to survival as food and shelter because it gave a people their sense of worth and permanence. This vision required boldness, for working with fire and molten metal is a dangerous task. To stand over the furnace, to pump the bellows until the air roared and the heat threatened to consume, demanded not only physical strength but spiritual confidence. The artisan was not a mere laborer, he was a mediator between the raw chaos of nature and the refined order of human imagination. He faced the fire, risked the burn, and yet trusted that with patience and precision, the metal would obey his will. This act was itself symbolic of the Igbo worldview, where life's hardships were seen not as walls but as raw material, where struggle was not a curse but a crucible through which character and destiny were shaped. In every bead and pendant, in every vessel and ornament, the artisan encoded a lesson that nothing worth having comes without the fire, and nothing beautiful is born without endurance. The vision of the Igbo artisan extended beyond the form. It was visible in the way they imagined trade, crafting objects that would travel far from Igbo Ukwu to other communities, carrying their reputation across rivers and forests. They knew that their work would speak for them in distant markets, that an intricately cast bronze or a perfectly strung bead was more than merchandise, it was an ambassador of identity. And so they poured their genius into every creation, confident that their artistry would open doors, forge alliances and expand networks. They were not confined by the boundaries of their village. Their vision stretched outward, embracing the possibility that their creativity could connect them to a wider world. In this way, their craft was both local and global, rooted in ancestral traditions yet expansive enough to influence and impress peoples they had never met. The artifacts of Igbo Ukwu remind us that true vision is timeless. 1,000 years after the last artisan laid down his tools, their work continues to astonish modern eyes. Scholars, historians, and metallurgists stand before these creations and confess their wonder, some even admitting that the techniques used surpass methods available in Europe at the same time. This is the measure of the Igbo artisan's vision, that his work could leap across centuries, defy the erosion of time, and still command respect in an age of machines and mass production. To create something that endures for a millennium is to declare that one's imagination has touched eternity. And the Igbo did not do this once or twice. They built an entire tradition of artistry that has survived in fragments but speaks of a whole civilization of vision. Yet what makes this vision most powerful is not only the beauty of the objects, but the message they carry for the descendants of those artisans. Too often Africa's story has been told as one of waiting, as if its people were spectators until others brought civilization. But the bronzes and beads of Igbo Ukwu say otherwise. They proclaim that Africa was not only participating in the grand story of human progress but leading it, innovating, creating, imagining futures long before outsiders arrive. The Igbo artisans remind their children that they come from brilliance, that within their veins flows the same daring imagination that once turned earth into elegance and ore into art. They remind us that vision is not about resources but about courage, not about what you start with but about what you dare to create. The story of the Igbo artisan is a mirror held up to all of us. It asks whether we too can see beyond the raw materials of our lives, whether we can look at obstacles and see opportunity, whether we can take the fire that threatens to consume us and turn it into a tool that shapes our destiny. Just as the artisan looked at unyielding ore and saw a vessel of beauty, we too are called to look at the challenges of our world and imagine solutions, to look at divisions and imagine unity, to look at despair and imagine hope. The true gift of the Igbo artisan is not only the artifacts they left behind but the mindset they embodied. That vision, when joined with resilience, can turn even the hardest material into a testimony of greatness. To expand on this truth is to see that the artisan's vision was not solitary but communal. Each work was created not for himself alone but for the society that valued it, used it, traded it, and passed it down. The vision was shared, nourished by collective pride, and carried by generations who preserved these objects even through turmoil and change. Vision then was not the property of an individual genius but the lifeblood of a community that believed in beauty, believed in innovation, and believed in the endurance of identity. The artisans of Igbo Ukwu were not isolated prodigies but representatives of a people who understood that greatness is a collective achievement, that every hammer strike, every bead polished, every mold carved was a contribution to something larger than themselves. And so the vision of the Igbo artisan stands as a challenge and an invitation. It challenges the world to discard the falsehoods that painted Africa as a land of darkness, for the light of those furnaces still shines in the artifacts we uncover. It challenges every person of African descent to see themselves not as inheritors of chains but as descendants of creators. It challenges every society to recognize that the capacity to innovate, to imagine, to build is not the monopoly of any one race or region but the shared heritage of humanity. And it invites us all to remember that within the raw material of our present lies the potential for a future of beauty and strength, if only we dare to see as the Igbo artisans once. In the end, the vision of the Igbo artisan is the vision of humanity itself, the belief that from the rawest beginnings can come the most enduring legacies, that from the hardest struggles can come the greatest triumphs, and that from the fires of adversity can emerge objects of timeless beauty. The artisans of Igbo Ukwu did not merely work with iron and bronze, they worked with imagination, with resilience, with hope. They looked at earth and saw eternity, and in doing so they left us a lesson that resonates through the ages: to never be content with what is, but to always believe in what can be, and to forge it with the fire of vision until the world stands in awe. The story of Igbo Ukwu holds within it a message that shakes the foundations of everything the world has been told about Africa and its place in history. Because hidden beneath the soil of southeastern Nigeria lay treasures that feared a truth too powerful to ignore, a truth that showed that Africa was not waiting for civilization to arrive, but was itself a fountain from which civilization poured forth. The 9th century artifacts uncovered at Igbo Ukwu spoke of metallurgical techniques so advanced, of artistry so refined, of imagination so daring, that scholars were forced to reconsider the tired narratives they had repeated for centuries, narratives that painted Africa as a continent of darkness, silence, and backwardness. To look upon the delicate bronzes, the intricate beads, the vessels of extraordinary beauty, was to look upon undeniable evidence that Africa stood proudly at the center of human innovation. These discoveries proved that the people of Igbo Ukwu did not simply survive but thrived, did not merely exist but flourished, and in their flourishing they created works that could rival, and in many cases surpass, those of civilizations considered the pinnacles of world history. This significance is not only in the brilliance of the objects themselves, but in what they declare about the people who created them. The artisans of Igbo Ukwu were not isolated villagers fumbling in obscurity. They were visionaries who had tapped into knowledge that allowed them to cast bronze with techniques that defied the assumptions of European archaeology. Their work displayed mastery of lost wax casting, an ability to control heat and materials with a precision that even modern scientists admire. Such sophistication did not emerge by accident. It was the result of centuries of accumulated wisdom, of cultural values that honored creativity, and of a worldview that saw beauty and meaning in everything. In this light, Igbo Ukwu becomes more than an archaeological site. It becomes a testimony that Africa's contributions to humanity are not marginal but central, not delayed but original, not inferior but foundational. When these artifacts were first unearthed in the 20th century, they forced experts to ask hard questions. How could a people dismissed as primitive have achieved such artistry 1,000 years ago? How could metal work so refined, so intricate, so impossibly delicate exist in a land that colonial education had taught the world to see as barren of progress? The answer was simple: the world had been lied to. For generations, Africa's history had been buried under layers of prejudice and distortion, not because it lacked greatness, but because acknowledging that greatness would dismantle the myths upon which colonialism and slavery were built. The global significance of Igbo Ukwu lies not just in the artifacts themselves, but in the way they strip away the mask of lies, the way they force humanity to see Africa not as a receiver of civilization but as a giver of. These treasures remind us that civilization is not a single story flowing from one region outward, but a vast river with many sources, and Igbo Ukwu is one of those powerful springs. Just as Egypt along the Nile shaped early human knowledge, just as Mesopotamia influenced writing and trade, so too did Igbo Ukwu stand as a beacon of African ingenuity. The significance here is that Africa was not silent between the pyramids and the colonial period. It was alive, inventive, dynamic, and proud. To place Igbo Ukwu in the heart of this narrative is to affirm that Africans were shaping the destiny of the world long before Europe ever set foot on their soil. And this matters because the erasure of African contributions has been one of the greatest thefts in history, a theft not only of land and people, but of dignity and recognition. Igbo Ukwu restores part of that stolen dignity, proclaiming to the world that Africa has always been a creator, not a beggar, always a leader, not a follower. The artifacts themselves, with their dazzling precision, carry stories that stretch beyond the Igbo community. They speak of trade networks reaching across lands, of connections with regions far beyond West Africa, of exchanges that prove Africa was never isolated. Glass beads discovered in Igbo Ukwu have been traced to lands far away, showing that these people were already engaged in global trade, already part of a wider human story, already influencing and being influenced in ways that challenge the narrow lens of history taught in West. This interconnectedness reveals another layer of global significance. Africa was not merely reacting to the world, it was shaping it, contributing to patterns of trade, culture, and innovation that linked humanity together. The very existence of Igbo Ukwu challenges the most poisonous myth of all, that Africa had no history. For centuries, colonizers justified their conquests by declaring the continent a blank slate, a place without memory or accomplishment, a wilderness waiting for foreign hands to bring order. But Igbo Ukwu shatters that illusion. Here we see evidence of a civilization that valued art as much as survival, symbolism as much as sustenance, refinement as much as strength. Here we see proof that Africa's history was not one long night, but a dawn that has been hidden behind the smoke of prejudice. The global significance of Igbo Ukwu lies in its power to awaken both Africans and non-Africans to the truth that the continent's story is not one of absence but of presence, not of silence but of eloquence, not of dependency but of autonomy. For the African child growing up in a world that too often tells them they are the descendants of weakness, Igbo Ukwu speaks a different message. It declares that their ancestors were not broken but brilliant, not voiceless but visionary, not waiting to be taught but already teaching the world. To place Igbo Ukwu at the center of global civilization is to give back to that child a stolen inheritance, a reminder that they come from people who mastered fire and metal, who turned soil into splendor, who carved identity into bronze that no empire could erase. And for the world at large, the significance is equally transformative because it forces a re-evaluation of humanity itself, a recognition that greatness is not the monopoly of any race or region, but the shared gift of all. Even today, when museums display these artifacts, visitors are struck by how modern they appear, how timeless their elegance remains. This is the final proof of their global significance. They transcend time, culture, and geography, speaking a universal language of creativity, discipline, and imagination. They show that Africa's past is not locked in ruins but alive in forms that continue to inspire. They invite us all to step out of narrow visions of history and to embrace a fuller, truer narrative, where Africa is not on the margins but at the center, where Igbo Ukwu is not an exception but an example of a broader legacy of African brilliance. The significance of Igbo Ukwu is therefore not merely archaeological, it is spiritual in the sense that it revives the spirit of a people, political in the sense that it reclaims a stolen narrative, cultural in the sense that it recenters Africa and the human story. To speak of Igbo Ukwu is to speak of the unbreakable fact that Africa has always mattered, that it has always created, that it has always given to the world treasures of mind and as long as those artifacts remain, as long as their beauty continues to defy erasure, the truth of Africa's central place in civilization will continue to shine, challenging every falsehood, inspiring every descendant, and reminding humanity that the story of greatness belongs to us all.